The Silver in the Bog. A sleep essay on the Gundestrup cauldron. On the 28th of May, 1891, 3 men were cutting peat in a small bog in northern Jutland. The bog was called Rivamos, the Fox Marsh, and it lay near a hamlet called Gundestrup in the district of Himmerland, which is a low, wind-scoured country of heath and shallow lakes and long horizons. Peat cutting is patient, rhythmic, unglamorous work. You slice down through the wet black layers with a long spade, and you stack the bricks of peat to dry, and you do it again, and the day passes in the smell of iron and rot and old water. There is nothing in the work that prepares a person for what those 3 men found about a metre down. They found silver. Not a coin or a brooch or a scattering of fragments, but a great heap of worked silver plate, stacked and nested, and when it was lifted out and cleaned and slowly understood, it turned out to be the largest and richest piece of decorated silverwork that survives from Iron Age Europe. A cauldron, not a cooking pot in any ordinary sense, but a vessel roughly 69 centimeters across and a little over 40 centimeters deep, weighing just under 9 kilograms. Capable of holding well over 100 liters of whatever 100 liters of something might be worth holding. It was made of 13 decorated plates, 7 for the outside and 5 for the inside, and 1 round plate for the bottom, joined to a plain silver bowl, the whole thing gilded in places and set with small pieces of colored glass for the eyes of the figures. And it had been taken apart. That is the first strange thing, and it is worth sitting with before anything else. The people who put the cauldron in the bog did not simply drop it in. They unfastened the rim, they removed the side plates, and they stacked those plates carefully inside the empty bowl, and then they placed the bundle in the ground. Whatever else this was, it was not an accident, and it was not concealment in any hurried sense. It was a deliberate act of disassembly, followed by a deliberate act of burial, performed on an object of extraordinary value, in a landscape where such things were given to bogs on purpose and were not meant to come back. That is where the story begins, and almost immediately it stops making sense, which is exactly why people have been arguing about it for 130 years. Consider what is actually on the plates. On the inside, the most famous of them shows a figure sitting cross-legged, beardless, wearing antlers. Real antlers, growing from the head, matched almost tine for tine by the antlers of a stag standing beside him. In his right hand, he holds a torc, the heavy neck ring that is one of the most recognizable objects of Iron Age Europe. In his left hand, he grips a serpent, and the serpent has the horns of a ram. Around him, arranged in the flat, crowded, symmetrical way that this kind of art likes, are other animals. A wolf or a dog, a boar, a lion, a small human figure riding a fish or a dolphin. He looks out at the viewer with perfect composure. He has been called Sir Nunnos for a very long time, though that name comes from a single Gallo-Roman monument in Paris, the Pillar of the Boatmen, and there is no inscription anywhere on the cauldron telling us what anybody's name is. On another interior plate, a woman's bust, wearing a torc, fills the center. Beside her are wheels with 6 spokes. Around her are griffins, and beneath her a great cat, and above her, unmistakably, elephants. Elephants on a silver vessel found in a Danish bog. On a third plate, a bearded man holds up a broken wheel, while a smaller figure, wearing a horned helmet, leaps up to take hold of the other side of it. On a fourth, the same scene appears 3 times in a row. A bull, and a man with a sword, and the sword coming down, and a dog and a cat below in the same posture each time, as though the artist were showing a single act in the way a liturgy shows a single act, by repeating it. And then there is the plate everybody remembers after the antlered god. It is divided by a horizontal band into 2 registers. Along the bottom, a file of warriors on foot marches to the left, carrying spears and long oval shields, and behind them come 3 men blowing enormous curved war trumpets with animal heads at the top. At the head of the line, A figure of much larger size holds a man upside down over a vessel, apparently lowering him into it head first. Above the dividing band, riders on horseback move back the other way, to the right, wearing crested helmets, and among them runs a horned serpent as long as the plate is wide. Whatever this is, it is not Danish. Nothing remotely like it had ever been found in Scandinavia, and nothing remotely like it has been found there since. The elephants alone would settle that. But it is also not quite anything else. The style, the crowding, the frontal faces, the way a god's head can swell to fill an entire panel while his body shrinks below it, the taste for beaten relief rather than incised line. These belong to a world, but working out which world has taken generations. Begin with the metal, because the metal is the part that cannot lie about its origins, or at least cannot lie in the same way that art can. Silver is almost never found pure in the ground. It comes out of ores, usually lead ores, and lead is where the trick lies. Lead in nature has 4 stable isotopes, 4 versions of the same element with slightly different weights. One of them, lead 204, has been there since the Earth formed and is not made by anything. The other 3, lead 206, 207, and 208, are the final resting states of long chains of radioactive decay that begin with uranium and thorium. Uranium-238 decays, through a long series of intermediate steps, into lead 206. Uranium-235 decays into lead 207. Thorium-232 decays into lead 208. All of this happens at rates that are known with great precision, and that nothing in ordinary chemistry can hurry or delay. So when an ore body forms, somewhere in the crust of the Earth, it captures a particular mixture of uranium and thorium and lead. And from that moment onward, the ratios of the lead isotopes in that ore body drift in a direction determined by how much uranium and thorium were in the mix, at a rate determined by their half-lives. 2 ore bodies formed at different times, from source rocks with different uranium content, end up with measurably different isotope ratios. The ratios become a fingerprint. And crucially, smelting does not change them. Melting does not change them. Hammering, alloying, gilding, burying in a bog for 2,000 years. None of it changes them, because the difference between the isotopes is a matter of a few neutrons and not of chemistry. This means that a piece of ancient silver carries, invisibly, a record of the mine it came out of. Not a label with a place name on it, but a set of numbers that can be compared against the numbers measured from known ore deposits. It is a comparison, not a reading, and it has all the weaknesses that comparisons have. If nobody has ever sampled the relevant mine, the fingerprint matches nothing. If 2 distant ore bodies happen to have similar histories, they can produce overlapping fingerprints. And, worst of all for our purposes, if the metal has been melted down and mixed with other metal, the resulting fingerprint is a blend, an average of sources that may correspond to no single place at all. In 2005, a large team of Danish researchers published the most thorough scientific study of the cauldron that had ever been attempted in the journal Acta Archaeologica. They took 45 samples of the silver, 11 of the gold, and 10 of the tin solder, and they ran the lead isotope analysis on all of it. What they found was not a single answer, but a scattering. The silver had not come from one mine. It had come from several, and it had been mixed. The copper content of the alloy varied from plate to plate, from about 1.5% up to something above 8%, which is exactly what you would expect if a workshop were melting down separate batches of scrap and old objects rather than drawing on a single refined stock. The isotope signatures pointed, on the whole, toward ore fields in what is now northern France and western Germany, which is to say toward the Celtic world of the pre-Roman Iron Age. But it was not clean, and it was not one place. The tin was a different story, and, in its way, a more startling one. The plates were joined to one another with tin solder, and the tin solder was remarkably uniform and remarkably pure, and its lead isotope composition was consistent with tin from Cornwall at the far southwestern tip of Britain. Whoever made this vessel, wherever they were sitting, had access to tin that had traveled from the Atlantic edge of Europe, and they had enough of it, and it was good enough, that they could use it for structural joins on a piece 9 kilograms in weight. Then there is the gilding, and the gilding turns out to be a technical detail that carries a surprising amount of information. There are two broad ways to put gold onto silver in the ancient world. One is fire gilding, in which gold is dissolved in mercury to make an amalgam, painted on, and then heated so that the mercury boils away and leaves a thin, even, beautifully adherent film of gold behind. It is elegant, it is durable, and it is extremely bad for the person doing it, because mercury vapor is a poison that destroys the nervous system. The other way is mechanical. You make gold foil and you lay it down, and you fix it in place by burnishing and by punching, driving the foil into the roughened surface underneath until it grips. When the analysts looked at the gilded areas of the Gundestrup plates, they found no mercury at all. What they found instead were closely spaced punch marks across the gilded surfaces, the signature of foil hammered into place. The gilding was mechanical. And there was more than one kind of it. The gold sorted into two groups by purity, and the less pure, thicker gold sat in places that looked like repairs. Somebody, at some point after the cauldron was made, had gone back over it and patched the gold, and had done it with worse material. The same study did something cleverer still with the tool marks. The surfaces of the plates are covered in punched ornament. Thousands of small impressions made by driving a shaped steel tool into the silver from the front to raise texture and detail. Every punch has an individual profile, the way every stamp does, with its own microscopic irregularities. The researchers took silicone rubber molds of the punched areas, which capture detail down below the limit of what an eye can see, and put those molds under a scanning electron microscope, and they began sorting impressions by tool. The punches sorted into distinct kits. 3 at minimum, by some counts more, each kit a set of tools that belonged together and appeared together. And then came the important observation: no single plate carried marks from more than one kit. The plates were not all made by one person, with one set of tools. They were made by different silversmiths, each working with his own punches, on separate plates, and the plates were brought together afterwards. That also explains the variation in thickness, and the variation in the silver alloy, and some of the variation in style that had been puzzling people for decades. This was workshop production, several hands at once, and not a single artist's masterpiece. Even the bottom plate turns out to be a complication. It is a round disc showing a bull with a female figure above its back holding a sword, and dogs around it, and a border of Greek and Roman scrolling ivy. It does not sit comfortably with the rest, and there is a real possibility that it began life as something else entirely. A phallera, one of those large decorative discs that were mounted on horse harness or on armor, later cut down and soldered into the cauldron as a repair. If so, then the object we call the Gundestrup cauldron is not even entirely one object. It is an assembly, and part of the assembly is a repurposed piece of something older. Which brings us to the dating, and the dating is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, in the way that good scholarship often does. Silver cannot be radiocarbon dated. Radiocarbon works on things that were once alive, because living things take up carbon from the atmosphere, including the small unstable fraction of carbon-14, and stop taking it up when they die, after which the carbon-14 decays away at a known rate. Metal has no carbon-14 clock in it. So for most of the 20th century, the cauldron was dated by style. By comparing its ornament, its weapons, its helmets, and its torcs to objects that could be dated by other means. That kind of dating produced a broad consensus somewhere in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era, with many scholars settling on something close to 100 years before the Common Era, and a wider range from about 200 before to some point after that. But on the backs of some of the plates, the researchers found beeswax. Beeswax used, presumably, as a backing or a filler during the working of the metal, or as part of a repair. And beeswax is organic. Beeswax can be radiocarbon dated. They dated it using accelerator mass spectrometry, which counts individual carbon-14 atoms rather than waiting to observe them decay, and which therefore needs only a tiny sample. And the result came back not in the last centuries before the Common Era, but in the Roman Iron Age, in the first several centuries of the Common Era. That is a very large discrepancy. It would make the cauldron considerably younger than nearly everyone had thought, and it would make its deposition in a Danish bog part of a quite different historical world than the one it had been assigned to. And then, in an addendum to the same body of work, a second laboratory, the Leibniz Laboratory in Kiel, ran samples of the same beeswax and returned dates roughly 4 centuries earlier than the first set of results. 4 centuries. On the same material, there are technical explanations one can reach for. Beeswax is a difficult material to clean, and contamination with modern carbon pulls a date younger, while contamination with old carbon pulls it older. Conservation treatments applied to museum objects in the 19th and 20th centuries introduced waxes and resins and consolidants of their own. And the Gundestrup plates spent a very long time in the care of people who had no idea that anyone would ever want to measure the carbon in the residues on the back. And there is a deeper problem, which no amount of laboratory care can solve. Even a perfect date on the wax is a date on the wax. If the wax was applied during a repair, it dates the repair. If it was applied in 1892 by a conservator who liked wax, it dates nothing at all about antiquity. So the honest position, which the researchers themselves largely take, is that the beeswax dates have not settled the chronology. They have complicated it. The cauldron is probably late Iron Age. It might be later. The object is not going to tell us, and the residue on its back has now told us 2 contradictory things. With the physical evidence laid out, we can turn to the argument, and the argument is the best part. The first serious readings of the cauldron, from the Danish archaeologists of the late 19th century onward, took it as Celtic. This was not unreasonable. The torcs are Celtic. The longswords are Celtic. The oval shields, with their central bosses, are Celtic. The boar crests on the helmets are Celtic. And the war trumpets on the warrior plate are the carnix, that upright bronze horn with an animal's head at the top, which Roman authors describe as making a sound designed to terrify, and which is one of the most distinctively Celtic objects in existence. Add an antlered god, add a wheel god who looks very much like the tyrannies known from Gaulish material, and the case looks strong. In the 1970s and 80s, the American scholar Garrett Olmsted pushed this line further and harder than anyone, arguing that the art of the cauldron matched the imagery on Billin coins struck by the Coriosolites in northwestern Gaul in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, that the lead isotope compositions were consistent with the silver used for those coins, and that the depicted weapons and armor belonged to that region and that period. He went further still and read the scenes as Irish myth, identifying the antlered figure with Cu Chulainn and the bull with Don Cuailnge from the great epic The Táin Bo Cuailnge, and other figures with Medb and Ailill and Fergus. Against this, in 1987, came a paper in the journal Antiquity by Anders Bergquist and Timothy Taylor that reframed the whole question by asking a different one. Not what the pictures show, but how the metal was worked. Their argument, in its essentials, is this. The iconography may be Celtic, but the technique is not. The particular way this silver is handled. Heavy sheet silver raised in bold repoussé from behind, and then finished with dense punched detail from the front, on a scale, and at a level of ambition that no Celtic workshop is known to have attempted, belongs to a different tradition entirely. It belongs to Thrace. The Thracians, occupying roughly what is now Bulgaria and adjacent parts of Romania, Greece, and Turkey, had a sheet silver tradition of extraordinary richness, known from a series of spectacular finds. The panegyrish treasure, the Ragos and hoard, the Letnitsa plaques, silver vessels, and harness fittings by the hundred. That tradition knows how to do exactly what the Gundestrup cauldron does. And there are details, Bergquist and Taylor argued, that are simply Thracian habits of representation and appear nowhere in Celtic work. The way certain figures' footwear is rendered, the compositional conventions, the treatment of certain animal forms. So who made it? Their answer was a specific historical scenario. In the lower Danube, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, there lived a people called the Scordisci, who were Celtic in language and culture, and who had settled in the region after the great Celtic migrations into the Balkans, in the neighborhood of the confluence of the Sava and the Danube, near modern Belgrade. The Scordisci lived beside Thracian populations, fought them, traded with them, and raided alongside and against them. If a Scordiscan chief wanted a great silver vessel showing his own gods and his own warriors and his own trumpets, he did not need a Celtic silversmith. He needed a silversmith. And the best silversmiths for 100 miles in any direction were Thracian. That accounts for the object. It does not account for the bog. And here Bergquist and Taylor reached for one of the most dramatic events in the history of Northern Europe. In the last decades of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, a people called the Cimbri came south. Ancient authors place their homeland in Jutland, and specifically the district of Himmerland has long been associated with them, on the strength of the name and of the geography. Whatever pushed them out, the sources say flooding, and modern scholars are skeptical, and nobody really knows. They moved, in enormous numbers, with the Teutones and others alongside them. And for more than a decade, they wandered across Europe destroying Roman armies with a regularity that terrified Rome as nothing had since Hannibal. They beat consular armies at Norea in 113, at Arausio in 105, in a defeat so catastrophic it entered Roman memory as a synonym for disaster. They went into Gaul, into Spain, back again. They were finally destroyed by Gaius Marius, the Teutones at Aquae Sextii in 102, and the Cimbri at Vercelli in 101. And in the course of that long migration, around 118 before the Common Era, the Cimbri are recorded as having come into conflict with the Scordisci on the Danube. So the scenario is complete. A Celtic people in the Balkans commissions a silver cauldron from Thracian craftsmen. A migrating people out of Jutland takes it from them. Some fragment of that people, or of their kin, brings it home to Himmerland, which is precisely where it was found. And there, whether in triumph or in obligation, it is taken apart and given to a bog. It is a beautiful piece of historical reconstruction, and it has the enormous advantage of explaining, in one motion, both why the object is stylistically foreign and why it is geographically absurd. It also has the disadvantage of being unprovable, and of depending on a chain of inferences, each of which is individually plausible and collectively fragile. The Danish archaeologist Flemmingkall, who has worked on the cauldron for decades, took up a version of the Thracian argument and refined it in a formulation that gives his best-known essay its title, Thracian Art, Celtic Motifs. On his reading, the workshop was Thracian, working somewhere in the lower Danube region, and the imagery was supplied by, or made for, people from the Celtic world. Kall emphasizes that the Celtic elements are not vague. The carnix is drawn by somebody who has seen a carnix, the helmets are drawn by somebody who has seen those helmets, the shields have the right profile. These are not half-remembered rumors of a foreign people. They are observations. And here the 21st century has quietly strengthened his case. in a way that has nothing to do with the cauldron at all. For most of the modern period, the carnix was known mainly from Roman descriptions, from coins, and from a single battered boar's head found at Deskford in northeastern Scotland. Then, in 2004, a French team led by Christophe Maniquet, excavating beneath a Gallo-Roman temple at Tintignac in the Corrèze, in central France, found a ritual deposit containing 7 of them. 7 carnices, 6 with boar heads and 1 with the head of a serpentine fantasy creature, all deliberately dismembered before burial, and one of them nearly complete. Suddenly, the instrument that had been half legend was an object you could measure, reconstruct, and eventually play. And the carnix players on the Gundestrup plate look right. Whoever cut those figures into silver had the real thing in front of him, or in his memory. Meanwhile, the elephants remain, and they are the most abused piece of evidence in the whole discussion. They have been connected to Hannibal, who did after all bring elephants across the Alps in 218, and that connection is irresistible and almost certainly wrong, or at least far too specific. Elephants were part of the visual vocabulary of the Hellenistic world for 2 centuries after Alexander. They appear on coins, on gems, on silverware, in contexts that have nothing to do with any particular general. A silversmith in the lower Danube in the 2nd or 1st century, before the Common Era, did not need to have seen an elephant or to have heard of Hannibal to know how to put one on a plate. He needed only to have seen other silver. The same is true of the griffins, which come from Greek and ultimately Near Eastern art. And it is true, in a deeper way, of the compositional idea that recurs on plate after plate. A central human figure, frontal and dominant, flanked symmetrically by animals held or mastered. That is the master of animals, and it is one of the oldest and most widely traveled motifs in the art of the ancient world, running back through Persian and Assyrian and ultimately Mesopotamian imagery for thousands of years before anyone in Denmark had ever seen silver. Which is why the third position in the debate, the one taken by the Danish scientific team, may be the most defensible even though it is the least satisfying to tell. Their view, put simply, is that the question is malformed. Asking whether the cauldron is Celtic or Thracian assumes that in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, there existed neatly bounded ethnic groups, each with its own art and its own metallurgy, and that an object must be assigned to exactly one of them. But this was a period of extraordinary movement. Celtic-speaking populations had spread across Europe from Iberia to Anatolia. Thracian, Scythian, Greek, Italic and Germanic-speaking peoples were in contact, trade, war, and intermarriage along every river system. Rome was expanding into all of it. Silver was being melted and remelted and moved. Craftsmen traveled because craftsmen have always traveled, and a good silversmith is a portable asset. Under those conditions, the expectation that a great object will be culturally pure is not a reasonable expectation. It is a 19th century expectation, imported into a 1st century world. The historian Ronald Hutton has made a similar point in a blunter form. The cauldron shows elephants, and its metal has connections that reach far from the Celtic heartlands, and continuing to file it as simply Celtic is a habit rather than a conclusion. And once you accept that, the object stops being a puzzle with a missing answer and starts being a document of something else, a network. The tin came from Cornwall. The silver came from several ore fields, likely including some in the Celtic West, mixed together from older objects that had themselves come from somewhere. The glass in the eyes is soda-lime glass of a Mediterranean type. The compositional grammar comes out of the Near East by way of the Greek world. The weapons and instruments are Celtic. The technique is Thracian, or belongs to a tradition that Thrace practiced best. Several different smiths, with their own tools, made their own plates. Somebody later repaired it with worse gold. Somebody, perhaps, cut down a harness disc to make it a floor. And then it traveled, by trade or gift or plunder, roughly 2,000 kilometers, to a place where nobody had ever made anything like it, and nobody could have. That is not a failure of identification. That is what the ancient world actually looked like when you get close enough to see it. There remains the bog, and the bog deserves the last word, because it is the only part of the story where we can be reasonably confident about intention. Rivamos sits near the much larger Boremos, and Himmerland in the Iron Age was a landscape in which bogs received offerings. Weapons, ornaments, food vessels, agricultural tools, and sometimes people. The bog bodies of Denmark, including several from Boremos itself, are among the most haunting archaeological objects in Europe. Wetland deposition was not rubbish disposal, and was not treasure hiding in the sense of putting something away to be collected later. It was a transaction with something. Water and marsh were thresholds, and things put across a threshold do not come back. There has been some argument, naturally, about whether Rivamos was even wet at the time. Early paleobotanical work suggested the ground was dry when the cauldron was laid down, and that peat accumulated over it afterwards, which would make it a burial in soil rather than an offering in water. A later investigation, around 2002, suggested the bog was already there. This matters for interpretation, but perhaps less than it first appears, because the treatment of the object tells its own story regardless of how wet the ground was. They took it apart. Consider what that means as an act. This was, in that world, an almost unimaginably valuable thing. 9 kilograms of gilded silver worked to a standard that nobody within 1,000 kilometers could match or repair. It had already been repaired at least once. It was probably old when it arrived, and whoever finally disposed of it did not throw it in, did not break it up for scrap, did not melt it down, which would have been the obvious thing for anyone who valued it as metal. They unfastened the rim. They lifted off the plates one by one. They laid them inside the bowl in a neat stack. And they set it in the ground. That is the behavior of people treating an object as a thing that must be closed rather than a thing that must be hidden. Elsewhere in Iron Age Europe, offerings are ritually killed before deposition. Swords bent double, spears snapped, shields punctured. The 7 carnices at Tintignac were dismembered before they were buried. The Gundestrup cauldron was not damaged, but it was undone. It was returned to its parts, made unable to hold anything, and then given away. There is something in that gesture that speaks across the distance more clearly than any of the iconography does. We do not know what the antlered figure was called, or what story the man being lowered into the vat belongs to, or whether the 3 repeated bulls are a myth or a rite or a decorative convention. Every one of those questions has an answer somewhere, and we are not going to get it. But we know that someone stood in a cold northern bog with a foreign masterpiece in their hands and decided that the correct thing to do with it was to take it carefully to pieces and give it to the ground. And then, of course, the ground gave it back. Peat is an extraordinary preservative, anaerobic and acidic and cold, and it held those plates through the fall of Rome and the arrival of Christianity and the Viking centuries and the Reformation and the Industrial Age, until 3 men with spades on a May morning in 1891 cut down through the layers and found silver. The men, as it happens, then quarreled bitterly with one another over the division of the reward the Danish government paid, which is a very human ending to a very numinous story. The cauldron went to the National Museum in Copenhagen, where it sits now in a dim case, reassembled, complete except for one missing outer plate that has never been found and probably never will be. Reassembled, that is worth noticing too. The last thing its ancient owners did was take it apart. The first thing its modern discoverers did was put it back together. We looked at a stack of plates and could not leave it as a stack of plates. We had to make it a cauldron again, because a cauldron is a thing we understand, and a stack of plates is not. And in a way, that has been the whole 130 years of argument in miniature. The cauldron arrives in front of us as a set of pieces from different places: Cornish tin, Western silver, Mediterranean glass, Thracian hammering, Celtic horns, Near Eastern gods holding animals at arm's length. And we keep trying to reassemble it into one thing with one name and one home, because a single culture is a thing we understand, and a network of exchanges across a continent is much harder to hold in the mind. The scholarship that has come closest to the truth is the scholarship that gave up on the reassembly, that was willing to let the object be several things at once, made by several hands, carried by unknown routes, and finally set down in a fox marsh in Jutland by people who may have understood only a fraction of what they were looking at, and who honored it anyway. It is still there in Copenhagen. The antlered figure still sits cross-legged with the torc in one hand and the serpent in the other, perfectly calm, saying nothing. The elephants still walk above the goddess. The bulls still die, 3 times forever. And somewhere in the punch marks, invisible without a microscope and a silicone mold, 3 or 4 different men, who never told anyone their names, left the individual signatures of their tools in the silver, which is the only trace of themselves that any of them managed to leave behind at all.